I wasn't a great culture fit for Atlassian, and they tolerated me for a long time, so kudos to them. If you think you're right, just like go start your own company and prove it. Like, it's not that complicated, right? The only person I found that would loan me money, for example, to do this large app acquisition that I wanted to do was literally a loan shark that would literally break my knees if I didn't pay. One app that succeeds makes more money in 1 month than we've paid for all the apps combined. I would say, like, honestly, I quote unquote regret selling. I used to shoot big concerts and bands and stuff like that. So
Oh wow!
I've done
As in photograph or
Yep.
film?
Photo. No,
Wow.
shit at film.
So what was the last camera that you owned when you were doing that profession?
It was a Nikon, I forget, D5S, something. I don't remember. It would have been the top of the line Nikon full frame sports series in 2017, 2016-ish.
Oh wow! So you're still doing that in 2018?
I stopped when I moved to New York, which was 2016. And I sold my camera equipment in 2017 because I thought Atlas Authority was going to go bankrupt at the time.
So you invested your camera equipment money into...
No, I just like sold it to have it as a buffer.
Right.
And we never needed it.
Right.
But like there was a time where I was like...
Boris. How do you pronounce your family name?
Berenberg.
Berenberg. Where does that come from?
Good question. It's...
Did you look at your ancestry tree, basically?
So I know that like ancestral, like as far back as I know, it would be a combination of like Ukrainian, Russian, Jews. If you look at it from a language perspective, it's clearly got something German in there, right? Or like Yiddish.
That's
right?
what I
Most
thought
likely.
initially.
And then, it's something I've been asking like my parents is to understand like, how like last names transform as they move between different languages. Like, you're in Romania, you have one name, you immigrate to America, you spell it differently.
Yeah.
Right? Like that happens.
Everyone calls me Byro.
Yeah, yes, things like that. But like, I don't even mean that. I mean, literally the spelling would change in many cases, right? Like if you're going from Russian to English, like the alphabet is different, right? So inherently it has to change. So the interesting thing with the last name is that like, if you speak German or Dutch, like, and you look at my name, you're like, oh, this guy is either German or Dutch. And you would say, okay, Baron is, it can be one of two things, right? It can be either bear or it can be berry, as in like what you eat, right? Or like bear, the animal. And then berg is always mountain. Right. So it could be Bear Mountain or it could be Berry Mountain. And it's something I'm actually still trying to figure out. But yeah, it's like a side project of mine is to create like a family crest.
Really?
Yeah. It's like a very like egocentric activity.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. But I think understanding kind of which of those two it is, or maybe merging it or something would be kind of an interesting.
Well, I do have, I wouldn't call it a family crest, but I would say my own name logo.
Yeah.
Because that right there, can't see it on camera. That is F and that is a B.
Yep.
So Florian Biro. So that's my own crest, personal
crest. Yeah, that's great.
I'll see if Nikki wants to wear it. So she'll be like, no.
First child, you have it. She's like getting out of the hospital. You come home, you hand her the kid, and you're like, wait, did you get a tattoo on this kid? Like, no, honey.
That would be funny. Well, actually, that for a very long time, because we worked in the same industry and we were actually on the same Slacks and the same communities. Every single time I saw your name, I thought that you were either Russian, Ukrainian, or German. It was only when I think we had a call, the first time we talked in person, had a call or something, and I heard your American New York accent.
Well, I don't think I have a New York accent, but I am Russian and I am Ukrainian. There's a complex story there that I cannot explain on a recorded format. So if you care, you can ask me after. But I was born in Russia and then I immigrated to the US in 94 when I was 6. I think I'm a year younger than you are. All your info's public on Company's House.
Yeah.
I'm not used to that in the US.
Is it not?
No, we don't have that. So I was prepping for this. I was like looking into your history, and some of your Company House registrations came up. Anyways, so immigrated to California, grew up in California most of my life, and lived mostly in the San Francisco area, kind of actually by Cupertino, where Apple is based out of, and then lived also a bit in San Diego and Amsterdam a little bit, and then moved to New York, and that's been the HQ for the last 7-8 years, something like that.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't feel like you have a harsh New Yorker accent, but I don't know if that bothered you or not. If someone says, "Oh, you sound very New Yorker," because you love New York.
I love New York. The thing that nothing like that bothers me. The one thing that I find really entertaining is I'll meet somebody at an event and they'll say to me, like blah blah blah, whatever. We're talking for like 10 minutes, and then at some point they're like, "Oh, Boris, where is that name from?" And I say, "Oh, I'm Russian," and they say, "Ah, that's the accent." And I'm like, yeah, if you think I have a Russian accent, then it's more of a reflection on your lack of knowledge of Russian accents.
You have I don't think you have any foreign accent. You're 100% American.
I would say it's a California, like a lazy Californian accent. I say like a lot, and hella, all of these things that happen in Northern California.
That's fine. We'll keep all of that in because we need the authentic you. Okay.
There you go.
So what's your background? What did you start in? Let me preface this by saying, unlike other interviewers, I try to stay away from doing any research on my guests.
Okay.
And it's counterintuitive, right? Because usually guests like for people to know about them. But I find conversations a lot more interesting if I don't already know your history, and I can ask organic questions that any of the viewers that would watch this would ask you as well.
Yep.
So I know a little bit about you from Atlas Authority because we're in the same ecosystem, but I don't know your history. How did you get started in the professional world?
Well, I guess it depends how early you want to go. I guess when I was a kid, my grandfather worked at a company that made night vision equipment, and like he would just bring home like bags of screws. Like it'd be like a bolt, a washer, and a nut. Right. Okay. And you'd have like a box of like 1,000 of each. And then you'd have the little tiny baggies, and you'd have to put like 3 of each in a bag, and you'd do it. And
he was selling those smaller bags.
And basically, well, somebody had to do it. Right. And the company was like, well, we can pay this kid, $0.01 per bag or something. I don't remember. I'm making up the number. But, I guess I started working very young with stuff like that. And then I guess in high school, I was about 16 at the time. My mom convinced her boss to basically, let's say I wasn't doing super well in school, and my mom was trying to find a way to help me have a better application to college, and she thought work experience would help. And so she went to her boss and was like, "Hey, I don't care what it is, but like make up a job for him to do." And so they gave me a 2-week internship, and what they did was they took a box that was probably about 2 cubic meters in volume, full of Ethernet cables. If you know what those, if basically the computer is to plug the computer into a network, that type of thing. And the company made networking equipment, and this was the QA lab. So if you imagine a warehouse full of networking equipment with cables connecting to stuff so that people could test it, And when people wanted to test stuff, they would take a brand new cable, rip it out of the bag, plug it in. And when they were done, they would unplug it and throw it in this box. And as you can see, like the box keeps growing with used cables, but no one is sorting them and putting them back. And they were like, okay, we'll pay you like minimum wage basically to untangle these cables for 2 weeks. I went, I did that. And afterwards they liked me. And so they brought me in as a part-time cable untangler.
That's a proper job
quite
title.
literally, like that was my job, was untangling cables like 4 hours a day after school. I'm really good at untangling cables, like, or jewelry or anything like that. Like I can untangle anything at this point. I
have a couple of cables.
Yeah. We can do it afterwards, you know. But the next, like, I had a boss who was essentially the IT guy for the QA lab. And so from there, it turned into desktop support because, like, you know, once you burn through all the cables, like there's not that much left to do. The guy is overloaded. Someone's computer isn't turning on, right? So it's like, then I got asked like, okay, go figure that out, right? And so I learned that. And then because it's a networking company and we're running this QA lab, there has to be like a network that operates all this. So then I started learning how to like manage networking devices and configure larger networks and all of this stuff. And from there, I ended up actually getting a job as an IT admin somewhere, and then a QA person somewhere, and then like an IT admin somewhere again, and then support at a backup software company. And then kind of was leading support there for the product I worked on. From there, I hopped to Atlassian, where a friend of mine was an employee who referred me in. So I think at Atlassian, I was employee like 490 or something ever. And at the time, the total employee count was like 300 people, like active or something along those lines. So it was still a pretty small company.
What year was this?
This was 2012.
Okay.
Somewhere around, I think like February, January 2012. So started at Atlassian on the support team. And so I was doing Jira support for about 4 years. And I wasn't a great culture fit for Atlassian, and they tolerated me for a long time. So kudos to them. But a lot of the times I would be like, hey, we should do X. And I believe that X is the right thing. And they'd be like, no, Y is the right thing. And it would ultimately get to the point of, you know, there's not an objectively correct thing to do. There is just, you know, one person wants this way, the other person wants this way. And at some point, I think it was maybe even my boss or somebody, but it became like a recurring thing where people would say, hey, if you think you're right, just like go start your own company and prove it. Like, it's not that complicated, right? Like you're not going to get what you want here, right? So like go do something about it. And I didn't do that. I went and I guess at the same time, we were talking about this before, while I worked at Atlassian, I'd started a photography business. So I was doing like nights and weekends kind of photography of large kind of like concerts, nightclub events, bands, kind of electronic artists at large festivals, kind of, you know, all the fancy stuff you can imagine. So I left Atlassian. I went to work for Zenefits. Lasted about 3 months. Ran out of work to do. Asked them to let me go because.
Wait, but what role did they hire you on?
As a Jira admin.
Jira admin.
In fact, they interviewed me, and during the interview, I said, "Can I see your Jira system?" I looked at it, and they said,
"It's pretty good."
And
3 months.
No. I told them, I was like, you should not hire me. You don't have enough work for me. This will only keep me busy for 2 months. So they're like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's really bad. And I was like, okay, like, you're right. I don't know what I'm talking about. This is your system, your company. Like, you know, I have a technical background of analyzing this, but I don't know all the business processes. So fine. So I went to work there. I won't say the numbers, but let's say the pay bump from Atlassian was significant at the time. After 2 months, like I predicted, there was nothing left to do. Sat around doing nothing for 2 weeks, was really bored. My number one mandate at the time from my management was to reduce costs. And I was like, hey, I'm really expensive. And
you reduced yourself.
You're not getting any value out of me. Like, maybe you should reduce this cost.
Wow.
So
okay.
I started interviewing, and this was mid 2016, and I was interviewing with Priceline and with Uber, and this was right at the time when Uber had some of that really bad press about employee mistreatment. Susan Fowler, I believe, was one of the people involved. And I was like, I don't know if I want myself associated with a brand that has this in the same timeline, right? Because people will look at my LinkedIn, be like, oh, he worked there right when all this stuff was happening, right? Like, I didn't know if I wanted that. But Uber was really effective at running their onboarding, like their interview process, right? So we went from like first call to like, how much do you want in probably a week, right?
Oh, wow.
With Priceline, it was like, I flew out to New York, I met like people, did all this thing, and it was taking weeks. And Uber basically was like, okay, how much do you want? And because I didn't want to work there, but I wanted to be polite about it, I was like, oh, I'll just ask for a really unreasonable amount of money and they'll reject me and that'll be the end of it. And they came back with, well, that's very unreasonable of you, but we'll pay you 90% of that. And I was like, oh shit, that's a lot of money. I was like, great, I can use this to get more money out of Priceline, and I need to stall somehow. So I go to Uber and I say, hey, if you won't pay my very reasonable asking price, then I want to work 100% remote from New York. And they said, no. But if your manager doesn't care where you are, that's between you and them. And the manager was like, I don't care where you are. So basically I ended up taking an Uber job, moved to New York, lasted there about 8 months. And it was probably the best team I've ever worked on in my life. We didn't have to discuss things. Like Atlassian would release, I don't know, a security vulnerability or something. We would all independently read whatever document was released, and we didn't have to discuss it. We all knew what everyone thought. We all knew what the right thing to do was. Like, it was just like gelling.
So everyone was into it and basically hooked up to not just news, but to the Atlassian ecosystem.
Everybody.
So you didn't feel like there were lost souls in there that had no idea what was going on. It was a team
of extreme experts. I would argue that at the time there were 3 of us, maybe 4 by the time I quit, but I would argue that we were probably top 1,000 in the world in terms of Atlassian administration skills, maybe even top 100. I don't know, like somewhere in that band.
So then why did you quit after 8 months?
Exactly. So you're working in paradise, you're making a boatload of money.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. You know, you're working remote from New York City, like everything's, you know, awesome. And the answer was because there wasn't something next. Right? There was no promotion, there was no career path, there was nothing. Like, if we had a manager who was excellent. So if he quit or was let go or whatever, then one of us could have a promotion that was meaningful. If anybody in that role got a promotion to the next level, it would be a generic IT team management role. And so that would probably come with a pay cut, actually, because you're no longer specialized in this like highly valuable Atlassian niche, right?
Right.
So maybe if you could do like a multi-level hop into a different company or something, like you could pull something off, but there wasn't really a clear path forward. And
that to you mattered a lot more than the financial compensation and the well-being that you were experiencing there.
Yeah, I felt like there was a path, like I need to see some path forward for some, like, I don't know, I guess maybe it's greed, right? Like, you know, I forget the name of the guy, Jeremy something, but he was one of the team at Tiny, and I listened to a podcast, and he was talking about like interview questions, and I believe, maybe I'm mixing it, I think it was him, but he said that he likes to ask people what sin they're driven by. Right? Because like everyone has a certain amount of like, either they're driven by greed or pride or lust or whatever,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like no one's immune from it. That's like why they are these like universal kind of sins. And I don't know what I think it's probably pride more than greed, but like I think in starting Atlas Authority, I really had a chip on my shoulder, going back to that conversation about like Atlassian telling me like, hey, like if you think you know better, like prove it, right? Like,
and was that because, again, it sounds like a very rapid transition. When you think of a dream job, right, where you have good salary, you work with amazingly talented people, you're in a good position in a sense. You wouldn't leave that fast. 8 months is considered fast.
yeah.
So was that the main driver and motivator? Did you have that in the back of your head? I need to make these things happen. I need to have my own company. I need to prove Atlassian wrong or something like that.
I don't think it was that. I think it was actually like a very small thing, which is that I wasn't an employee of Uber. I was technically a contractor, and it was technically a 12-month contract. And
right.
I think our manager had basically, and I think the manager was the only employee. The rest of us were all on this like 12-month contract. And basically we'd been promised that like, we'll 100% convert you at 1 year. And we just got like a really strong feeling that that wasn't going to happen. Right. And so like, yeah, the cash comp was high, but there was like no equity comp. There were like very limited benefits. There was all the like downside of dealing with the intermediary contracting company. Yeah. And I felt like if the manager had essentially made a promise that the company didn't let him keep, right, which was that we would get the conversion. And so it very quickly became like, okay, like I can't trust the company, right? Like the team is excellent, but I can't trust the company to deliver on its word. And so I think that's roughly where it started. I think the other thing that also happened was that in parallel to all of this happening, I had actually, and this is one of those like revisionist history things where like in my memory, it's like I worked at Uber and after 8 months I quit and I started a services business. But if you actually go back and look at it, that's not true. The first thing I did was launch 2 apps before this, as I was leaving Atlassian, and they were making like pennies, but that was actually what started the whole thing.
So you basically were running those apps in the background while at Zenefits, while at Uber.
Yeah. And I mean, we still have them. Technically, both of them exist. And they, I mean, they were making like nothing. Like I think like less than $1,000 a year kind of thing. So I'd kind of seen that, and I think I had hoped that it would like magic, you know, like I build it and they will come, right? Like very, very typical first-time founder stuff. And I think what had happened was that in New York, there was an Atlassian community event that occurred pretty regularly, and I was meeting customers there pretty regularly. And I saw that my skill set from Atlassian. So in Atlassian support, right? Like they have tiers and skill sets and blah, blah, blah. But when I worked there, it was less stratified.
Yeah.
There was basically like support engineers and senior support engineers. That's it. And I was really, by the time I quit, I was just doing one thing, which was a customer has a massive Jira instance and it's running slow. And that was it. That was the only problem I solved, right? Yeah. Because it was like a very specialized form of troubleshooting, very specialized set of solutions. And it didn't really make sense to have everybody on the team doing this.
And to be honest, sorry to interrupt you with this, with the story, but I do think that in certain setups, that's perfectly okay to have. If that's how you're structuring your organization, to have like very, very specific roles and niche, but it's not for everyone, right? Not everyone would want to be part of that journey across, especially because I suppose they were growing really fast in that period when...
I mean, I don't really have a strong opinion either way. My point wasn't about that. My point was just to say that I actually got really lucky in terms of timing, because I had this very specific skill set of scaling Atlassian systems at a time where I had moved into a city where there were mega corporations, where I was going to these community events where the admins of the mega corporation instances were showing up and their systems were dog slow. And Atlassian at that time had a released data center, but it wasn't yet like a fully mature and stable product, right? And so you had this like confluence of things coming together, and it allowed for me to go to these large companies and say, hey, I was the guy that fixed this at Atlassian, and now you can hire me directly and I will fix this for you dirt cheap. And I charged $10,000 basically to fix this. Now, if you think about it, like if Jira goes down for an hour at a large corporation, they'll probably cost more than $100,000. And these guys were having outages like weekly or something. So 10K was like nothing. And as long as I came in and I did the job, I basically had immediate trust of all of the senior technical people dealing with Atlassian tools in that organization. So I was very, very quickly able to build out a roster of customers with whom I had a really high trust relationship. And that's how I was able to transition so quickly from like working for Uber for 8 months into like lining up a set of customers and being able to quit and know that I was going to be financially okay.
That seems very organic for you to transition to basically having your own company, Atlas Authority, because of these reasons. You had the badge. Doesn't, at the end of the day, working for Atlassian, that is a badge.
Yep.
And being able to, like you said, being able to tell your prospects at ACE events, I used to be the performance guy for you, at Atlassian. That's very important. I think also for those that might not realize this, that are not in the Atlassian ecosystem, when you say, if a Jira instance goes down for an hour, the customer might be losing $100,000. That's not exaggeration. Because
it's an understatement for many companies. Yeah.
If you have 1,000 employees, users that do run their tasks and run their entire project organization using Jira, Confluence, and so on, and they can't work for an hour because Jira's down, that is $100,000 or more of usage. So I'm curious, how did you figure out your pricing when you started at Atlas Authority? Because I suppose this has had some sort of influence of, hey, if these big issues, or did you ever try to quantify, well, your instance is dead slow, which is causing you this much money, and pay me this, and I'm going to save you that?
Yeah. So I was both smarter, I think, than the average first-time founder, in that I went really expensive per hour, right? From day one, it was $250 an hour, right? Like I was like, that's where we work at. And it was intentionally more expensive than pretty much anybody at the time in the US East Coast, right? I think, I won't say the name, but I think the most expensive partner at the time was $200 an hour. So intentionally it was priced as a hyper premium kind of service. The problem, what I didn't get right, was that I billed hourly. And what that resulted in was that I would come in and I would like literally, they're having an outage once a week, right? They have a cost, let's say, of $100,000 per outage, right? And I come in and I fix it for $10,000, right? Because $10,000 is 40 hours at 250 hours,
right?
$250 an hour, 40 hours. So the challenge of finding a customer, it's a large company, right? So now you have to go through procurement, you have to go through legal, you have to have the correct insurance policies, you have to have the right security procedures and stuff and whatever. There's like all this stuff that it takes to close one of these customers. So the marginal overhead of closing the customer basically took that 10K of like actual working hours and turned it in from like $250 an hour probably to less than $100 an hour, right? So it was expensive enough for me to like survive and make the company work, but it wasn't effective enough to actually build a business. It was just me getting by on essentially contracting jobs. And what I very quickly figured out was that what we needed to sell was more something like staff augmentation. So it would be like, hey, you know, you guys have an Atlassian system. You may even have an in-house admin. If you have an in-house admin, you can buy X number of hours from us per week, but you have to commit to at least 6 months of this.
I see.
Right? And you have to pay all 6 months up front.
That's what you mean with staff augmentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
is that the term?
That's what we called it. I don't know if there's also like we would place somebody to be your sole admin, right?
Yeah.
Or multiple admins. But I think a lot of our, like really the company, I think was by revenue and trust was built on this idea of like, hey, you have people doing this job. They're good, but they're not as good as we are. Now, you don't need somebody of my, right? Because that Zenefits story again, right? You don't want someone like me there for 2 months and then like there's nothing left to do. You want someone like me to come here, upskill your people, unblock them, right? Show them even like things like, because I worked at Atlassian support, I can tell you how to file a support ticket with Atlassian that will have a much faster positive outcome than if you just try to randomly send a ticket, right?
Yeah.
I'll tell you how to format it, what data to put in your first request, the keywords to say that'll like trigger internal policies.
Like, I know Boris. Yeah. Boris sent me here.
Yeah. Or like, hey, I know this person. He's your boss's boss's boss.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
like,
yeah. Oh, damn. Okay.
My favorite one was one time I filed a support ticket. And the guy responds back to me saying like, hey, can you please read this like knowledge base article? And I responded back with, can you please see who wrote that knowledge base article? Because I was the author of it.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm curious, before we go further with this, Zenefits.
Zenefits, yeah.
Did they ever call you back after that 2 months to say, Boris, we have some more burning fires?
No, I think Zenefits at the time was shrinking, right? This was after Parker was ousted. This was when David Sachs was the CEO. And I think they were basically managing a declining company. And then I believe it was sold not long after. I think the brands still remain separate. I'm not sure. But no, they weren't happy with me leaving though. Like they wanted to keep paying me and have me stay, but it was boring. Like, I have ADD and I can't like sit at a desk and do nothing for weeks on end.
Makes sense. Right. So then you decided that you're going to transform your business from, hey, I'm charging you for this finite project, this much amount of money, which in return, it turned out to be a lot less than you were thinking because procurement and everything that you have to go through in order to get ready to execute your work, which makes a lot of sense. But did you find that customers would have a one-off, or did you find that they would come back to you and you would still have access to stuff, you'd still be prepared for it? So were you losing that much money in logistics every single time with the same customer, or did you had not that much repetition with the same customer? Repeating projects.
If we had a customer where we did a one-off project, then working with them again the second time was drastically easier.
Right.
And we did plenty of one-off projects, and there were plenty of scenarios. One of our largest customers to date, that's still a customer. Actually, two of our probably the top two customers by revenue, if I had to guess, today are still customers which started on one-off projects. And I think in both cases, it started off as like a assessment where we would charge 10 grand for us to show up, and it was basically like 2 days of digging through your system with a set of SQL script. Again, this was all on-prem at the time, right? So SQL scripts to kind of analyze, how everything was done in your site, pulling a bunch of exports from it, analyzing all that, and then preparing a set of recommendations on what to do next, right? It's an amazing product to sell. A customer pays you to figure out what's wrong with their product or with their tool so that you can then sell them a list of services to fix those things, right?
Yeah,
Like it's pretty nice. But we were actually really bad at doing that. Like we do a good assessment, but we were really bad at like then selling them on doing the services to fix it. Like we couldn't create the urgency around the problems that we'd identified. But in both cases, we did that. They really liked the experience of working with us, felt we were professional, blah, blah, blah. And 6 months later, kind of called us back for other larger projects, which turned into kind of larger and larger and larger engagements over time.
And what was the challenging bits? One of the challenging bit around working with new customers. Is it usually for you the procurement stage, or are there other phases that are super challenging?
I think that there's two really challenging areas. One is, as a small company working with mostly large companies have a way of operating and processes that are typically inflexible. And so if they're like, yes, I want to see your certificate for, let's say, general liability, cyber insurance, blah, 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 right? And then they'll say, we want to see, $2 million in coverage for vehicles. And you're like, we don't have vehicles. Like the company owns no vehicles. Nobody who works for the company drives anywhere as part of our jobs. And they're like, it doesn't matter. We have to see this coverage as part of our onboarding. So we have to go out and buy coverage for something we don't even do. Fortunately, this type of coverage is super cheap it's cheap on a company basis, right? It's a couple grand a year, but it's a hassle of going and getting it, et cetera. And every enterprise has different requirements, et cetera. I think that's one problem. The second problem is the first time you work with a new customer, you really, really quickly have to understand the politics. And a lot of what a consultant does is to sell trust. It's not necessarily selling new ideas, right? You come in, like there's like a recurring joke, which is that like consultants come in and just tell management what the existing employees have already told them. And people are like, ha ha ha, consultants are useless. I'm like, no, the point isn't that I come in and tell you the same thing that person has told you. The point is that management has now paid to get a second opinion and confirm what that person has already told you. So it's about building trust. And if you come in and you essentially don't understand the political situation within a given customer and you align yourself with the wrong people, you will get kicked out very quickly.
Let me not generalize. How did you get good at it? Right? Is it something from your
I screwed it up a lot of
past,
times,
or is it just repetition and getting better at it?
I just screwed it up a lot of times. I got kicked out of a number of companies because I aligned with the wrong people internally, and I learned who you have to align with and the types of things that you have to align with. And it is not something I'm still great at. I'm still mediocre at it. I'm still getting better at it. I think even if we look at like yourself and me, right, in the Atlassian ecosystem, right, you were always much better than me at finding a way to align with Atlassian's, future outlook and desired roadmap, right? Whereas I was a bit more like trying to push back on it and try and shape it to my desires. And I think that impacted kind of like your app success versus our app success, right? Like it's definitely something I need to keep improving on. I'm not a amazing
You're not
guy.
A politician yet.
I'm not a politician. Yeah. I have many skills. Politics is not one of them.
But you made it work.
Yeah.
At what stage did you started hiring?
Yeah, I think the first few hires are this interesting catch-22, right? Of like, you're like, I have too much work to do myself, but I don't have enough work to support a second person. And for me, what that meant was that I kept trying to pull people in for specific contracts that customers had with us. So like customer A needs somebody, let's say for 10 hours a week, right? So I'd like go and try and hire somebody just for that 10 hours a week contract so that I could like make the money work. And it's really tough to get the people you want when you do that. And so there was a lot of churn in the early days, and this actually harmed customer relationships a number of times. And yeah, it was really challenging. And then like, I think that the main thing I learned from building my company was it's all a game of compounding, right? It's like, it's, you just don't die and compound. And I just kept doing this iteration of like slightly more successful and don't die, and slightly more successful and don't die. And when you're doing this loop, at some point, it goes from like slightly more successful and don't die to like slightly more successful and fail but fine, right?
Yeah.
And like you start like moving yourself slowly out of the danger zone. And it's slow. It's really, I would say it probably took 2 years maybe to get out of that danger zone. I mean, even before we started recording, we were talking about how at one point, I saw our cash balances dwindling, and it was like, it was getting really low. And I had been a photographer. I had, probably I would guess $30,000 of glass and camera bodies that I'd bought at that point. And I was like, shit, I need money. I'm going to go sell all this. I sold it to Adorama. I think they paid me like 3,000 or 4,000. Like it was a pittance.
Yeah.
And I walked home just crying the entire walk. Like in New York, nobody cares if you cry, so it's fine. But I had my like New York walk of tears, and I ended up not needing the money, but that was just the vibe, that was the feeling. It was just like
it's a rough feeling to know that you're unwell financially, be it for your own business or for let's say personal, like you can't afford this, you can't afford that. It's the same thing with us. Nikki and I didn't had money all the time. Yes, we did get seed investment, and we did I did had share options from the company that I was working for that got acquired by Accenture, but we were paying ourselves really low not to take money from the company and have employees and so on, and mainly living off of my share options in a sense, like the extra expenses that we had and so on, until we got to a point, maybe winter 2021 to beginning of 2022, which is a really rough patch where we had to, for the first time in a very long time, just make rations and be super careful with what we spend. And I'm the type of person that goes into the store and I don't look at the prices of stuff. I need this, let me take this. And when you have to start doing that, it's a tough pill to swallow. But fundamentally, you do what you have to do in order to survive. I do feel like you probably had also sentimental attachment, and you were quite proud of your filming gear, your photograph gear.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can tell you this, like I can tell you the exact numbers, right? My pay for the first 3 to 4 years of running the company was $40,000 a year, living in Manhattan, right? Yeah. Like when people are like, "Oh, New York's so expensive, it's impossible." I'm like, I did it on 40K. Like that was, I can break out the exact math to you to this day. I am the opposite. I always look at the price of everything that I buy at a store. Even now, when like I don't need to anymore, right? Like for anyone watching, I already sold the company. So let's just say I'm fine. And even with like my girlfriend, like we literally, she's like, oh, we should buy the organic version of this fruit. And I'm like, why? I just want the one that's like a couple bucks cheaper. Right. And I have to psychologically go out of my way to be like, okay, I have to go and buy the nicer version of this so that like, there's there's no arguments. But I, for a long time, knew exactly what my per meal spend was, for example. And, I was eating healthy, right? I wasn't eating garbage. I was eating healthy, but I was just cooking everything at home. And I typically operated at about $3 a meal, sometimes lower than that. And, between that and just not, drinking out or, eating out much, that cut the drastic majority of my expenses down. And even as the company scaled for a long, long time, I want to say up until like a year before I sold the company, I was always the lowest paid employee.
Good.
There was, and for context, right? Like people listening don't know where my staff are located. I was the only one living in one of the only ones living in the United States. This includes me being lower paid than the team in Vietnam. This includes me being lower paid than the team in Ukraine. It's like, this is not like an adjusted income thing. I was always the lowest paid, and I never allowed myself to be paid more than basically the lowest person in the company.
Yeah, well, exactly the same. I think what was lucky for Nikki and I was that we were a couple. So our very low pays got to a, okayish pay, not like starving level pay. But the same, like we were paid less than everyone. And we had people in India, Ukraine, Brazil, and so on. We were the only ones in an expensive country. And I think I don't think necessarily everyone should do this. If you want to build a lifestyle business and you want to maintain a lifestyle business and so on, making sure that you're good is important as well. But if you want to squeeze as much investment as possible into your business and into the future of your business, being too wasteful with your money and your salary, because I've seen, like, I've been pitched. I don't know if you started doing investments and things like that.
Same as you.
Like I've been pitched by people that were paying themselves $150K a year, and I'm like, dude, what are you doing? You have a startup and you're paying yourself crazy salaries.
I had a friend come to me for advice, and he was like, "Oh, I have this idea. I want to start fundraising for it. Here's how much I want to raise, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, okay, like, tell me like why you want this amount and how you want to use it. And, what's your justification basically here? And he like walked me through it. And I was like, well, why is your pay set to this number? And he's like, well, I've got a wife, a kid on the way, blah, blah, blah. I was like, nobody gets paid that much. Like there's no founder taking that outside of like, mega VC funded, like not just unicorn companies, but unicorn founders, right? Like you got to be like some real special to take that kind of money.
If you want that kind of pay, just get a job. There are jobs that are being paid that much.
Yeah. I mean, even yesterday, right? I had a founder text me. He said, hey, I talked to a bunch of VCs and they don't think that I'm thinking big enough and I need to raise this much money, blah, blah, blah. I was like, look, that's true. And you're in a funding dead zone because your competition isn't other startups. Your competition is the returns that I, as an investor, can get from the S&P 500 at this point, right? So if you're going to build a small company and you want to raise money, you're not raising money. You're asking for donations, really.
Yeah.
Right. And he was like, oh, well, then, like, how do I fund it? I was like, oh, there's this Calm fund you can look at, but they only work with profitable companies. And I was like, what you should do is probably like just go consult, like go get a consulting job, like take the money, like work 20 hours a week, work on this the other 20. Like
that's how a lot of companies get started. And I was talking a couple of weeks ago with Gorka as well, and and he wanted to build a product, but he didn't have the budgets.
Yeah.
He ran out of money, so he had to start doing consultancy and services and so on. And eventually that worked and started building. So I think that's one way to do it, where you don't have to. But I also feel that we live in this world where getting funded is so just normalized that before you even have an idea, you think
it's not even normalized. It's romanticized.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, it's the expectation of like, oh, you have to get money from somebody else. And it's like, VC is a very, 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 very bad way to take money from somebody, right? Like, it is the most expensive money you can possibly get, right? When you go to the bank and they're like, we want to charge 20% interest. Actually, I heard about somebody in our ecosystem who apparently is charged like 25% interest right now for a loan. I'm like, that's insane. But anyways, 25% interest, right? If you do the math on it, is exorbitant. It is, borderline evil. And VC is worse than that.
Yeah.
Like, any VC money is worse than that. So you have to really, really understand, like, what are you building? Does it align with the financing model? And will the investor get a return from your business that aligns with their needs and your needs? And if the answer is no, don't get into bed with someone that's going to have equity control over you, right? And depending upon how that equity, like, I think a lot of people are like, oh, I only sold 20% of my company. I can do whatever I want, right? Like, I can even dilute them out of the whole thing. Well, it depends on how it's written, right? They could have a provision preventing that, right?
Yeah.
They could have veto provisions on creation
most of them
new
have,
shares.
like,
Yep. It's a common thing, but I think most founders only hear the very high level narrative, and they don't do their due diligence on what really is VC and how it interacts with them as individuals and how it interacts with their companies. And I think that if I look at the percentage of ideas pitched to me, I would say the number one rejection that I give to them is, this is a wonderful company, but you need to self-finance. Like, this is not an externally financeable idea.
Yeah.
Right? Like, maybe you're an amazing founder. Maybe it's an amazing market. That's all fine. Right? But like, what you're working on today, this is not, like, it just can't be big enough.
Yeah. It is that. It's also having strong enough reasons to get finance, right? Like, show me how this will drastically help you. And also understand, like you said, understanding the rules of the game, because a lot of founders don't understand what it means to get investment. A lot of people think it's completely free money. From my perspective, when I put money, it is free money. Like, I'm not. A lot of the investments that I do are in the individuals.
Yep.
And what happens is you have to have a lot of a large portfolio of investments as an investor, angel investor, in order to get a return, to get your money back, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not every single investment that I make, I'm like, you need to give me my money back and then some, because then I would just become a loan shark or something like that, if that would be the case.
I think that I definitely don't go after everybody. But there are definitely investments where I put more time than others.
Mm-hmm.
And those tend to be the ones that I would say are like, because the failures are easy to let go, right? They're like, well, failed, great, whatever, write it off. But the ones that are like, they have a chance and the founder's not quite putting their foot down in the right way, those are the ones where I'm like, I can even tell you, like, the number one thing I tell founders, I'm like, stop shipping product and start talking to customers and selling. I'm like, you do not need another feature. You do not need to rewrite the back end. You do not need this or that. Yeah. If it doesn't sell new units in the next month, don't do it. Like, you just need to get your MRR up. Nothing else matters. And it's really tough to convince people to do that, because it's really, really hard to do sales. And if you haven't done sales before, you're going to suck at it. It's like running or like riding a bike or anything. Like, you're just going to suck at it, and you got to go and you got to suck at it for a while. And the earlier a founder starts, the faster they'll get to like being good enough. You don't need the point of a founder selling isn't to become the best salesperson ever. You'll hire those. The point of the founder selling is to do product discovery and to become a good enough salesperson to create a sales process that can be handed off to better salespeople.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what I talk about. Mention it on this podcast a couple of times. It is important to experience a lot, if not all, of the departments that you're going to put in place in your organization, because otherwise you have no idea what people are talking about, and how would you link what they're doing with your strategy and higher level mission if you have no idea what they're talking about. Did you had any funding at Atlas, or are you completely bootstrapped?
100% out of pocket. Yeah. 100% out of pocket, but keep in mind, I was an employee at Atlassian for 4 years, and I had a lot of equity, pre-IPO, right? Mm-hmm. And then, granted, I sold most of it at $28, so my opportunity cost there's a few million. But, initially between the customer, between like committed customer revenues that we had, and I think I did have to sell shares at one point. Like, yes, I was able to self-fund all the way through. I had looked for access to capital on multiple occasions. I even wrote a blog post about it called like Funding Not Secured one time. But that was mostly focused on M&A, where like I wanted to acquire. So we talked about kind of the services side of the business, right? But I also mentioned those 2 apps early on. Yeah. So what we started doing was taking the profits from the services business and investing it into the product side of the business.
Controversial.
No, not at all. In fact, it's like, that's literally the Atlassian story, right? It's actually a very, very, very common product story.
Yes, but I've seen so many people complaining about that, and that's why there've been a couple of company splits.
What would be the complaint? Do you mean in our ecosystem?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I mean, like it's definitely different strategies. It has different, et cetera. I would just say that as much as we hear about all this VC funded stuff and blah, 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 it is extremely common for companies you would have heard of to have started as consultancies that funded product development, and then they shut down the consultancy side of the business over time. This is a very, very common path for I think HP even started kind of similar to this. And the important thing for me was that because I didn't have external financing, and because the licensing side of the business was very spiky, right? Like I would do, let's say, like I sell a massive license, $500,000 in a single transaction, back in the day. So you have cash flow problems, right? I have to pay Atlassian day 0. Customer has to pay me, let's say 30, 60, 90 days later, whatever. There's that, negative cash flow cycle. So it's like, where's the money coming from in the meantime to pay salaries, right? And to your question of like hiring people, right? If you have services business that's spiky and I want to retain a full-time consultant, where's the money coming from to pay them? So for us, the desire to get into products was as a function of smoothing out monthly income, basically, and monthly revenue. And so, we did all that. But going back to kind of where we started was there were opportunities and in fact, we did acquire most of our apps. Most of the apps that we have today were not built in-house. We bought them and we grew them. And there were other opportunities where we just needed more money to buy the thing that we wanted to buy. And that's where we tried to get outside financing and capital markets in the United States for small businesses 4 non-tangible asset purchases are basically non-existent, or the rates are quite literally usury. And like the only person I found that would loan me money, for example, to do this large app acquisition that I wanted to do, was literally a loan shark that would literally break my knees if I didn't pay. Like that was the only option I found.
Yeah. Have you been alone in this Atlas Authority journey from the beginning until the end? Why is that?
It wasn't intentional. It was just I didn't have a good partner. I think a few times I tried to recruit people in, but I basically told them, I was like, look, you got to buy half the company, right? And here's its current valuation. And it pretty quickly got to a point where like people just didn't have that kind of money laying around. I think in hindsight, the thing I should have done was not focus on trying to get a co-founder, but on trying to build a management team, right? Like I kept Atlas Authority very flat. I think it was pretty much everyone reported to me, or like quasi-reported to me, even at the time I sold the company. And I think at the time we were like 16 people or something.
Right.
Which, maximum you can theoretically manage is like 10, I think is what most advice says. And instead, what I should have been doing was saying like, okay, someone's going to run services. Someone's going to run products, for example, or, someone's going to be an operations person. I don't know. But there should have been some kind of a management team that I put into place rather than having everything go through me.
How did you manage that? 16 people is a lot. It's a lot for you to be the only source of decision and management.
Highly async. We almost never had meetings. A, B, being a bad manager. How do you do this thing that no one can do? You don't. You fail at it. I was a bad manager. That's the actual answer, right? Also being, I guess, fortunate in some sense that I'm fairly generalist. So, for example, I acted as like the IT guy. So like I would manage a giant cluster of Docker containers running various versions of Jira and Confluence for our test environment. And then, automation tooling on top of that for, financial analysis and all this kind of stuff. So I was doing like financial analysis of what we were doing. I was doing like data side. I was doing IT side. The only thing I wasn't doing was like, I guess, bookkeeping and like compliance. That was really like fully offloaded. I was trying to lead marketing, though I was doing a terrible job there. I was definitely leading all of product. In many ways, I was leading engineering decisions. And I think that, I think it's something you'll ask later, like the piece of advice kind of question, right? But the big thing that, I alluded to this earlier is like, the name of the game is don't die and compound, right? So a lot of the success of like running 16 people was this idea of like, well, if I just keep us alive and things continue to improve, like over time, it just multiplies into a really big number.
And how did you manage to do that? I really like the don't die and compound, but the don't die thing is hard because so many businesses fail out there. There's a ton more failures than successes. So how did you manage not to die? What did you?
I think it's hedging, right? Like, so for example, I'm a very risk-taking individual, right? Mm-hmm. I will do, road motorcycles, raced cars, snowboard, scuba diving, jumping out of airplanes. Like, if you can think of a risky thing, I've probably done it at some point.
So you're like, well, I didn't die for that, so I'm not going to die.
Well, actually, I have like more than 10 near-death experiences. But this is actually where I'm going with it, is that, like, for example, I used to ride a motorcycle. My safety equipment cost more than my motorcycle did, right? So when I did have a really bad crash, it was like, it wasn't okay. I still have pain in my shoulder, but relatively it was okay, right? I had very, very good safety equipment. The very, very good safety equipment took care of me. It happened at a racetrack, which meant that when I went flying, I hit, soft dirt and grass, which absorbed some of the impact. I was at a place that had, EMTs and stuff that could take care of me. So I was doing a risky thing, but I had hedged the risk, right? And in Atlas Authority, that hedge was in the form of differing lines of revenue, right? We had the services revenue, we had the licensing revenue, and we had the apps revenue. And so if any one of those, even if two of those had a bad month, the staffing and the cost structure of the company was designed such that we could absorb it out of basically one of the three.
Right.
And over time, because I took so little for myself, one of the things we built was a huge cash pile. We literally just had like $1 million in cash sitting in the bank. And that was a safety blanket of sorts for both the licensing business, because again, you have this negative cash flow cycle. So you needed to, let's say, it did get to the point where we were literally buying like $1 million of licenses for a customer and then having to essentially loan them that $1 million for 90 days. So we needed to have $1 million in cash to cover in the meantime, right? So there was that side of it, but it was also like, if you have a bad month and you don't hit your targets, like you still have this cushion and everyone's getting paid. You don't have to worry about any of it, and you can focus on growth. Like the moment you get to this point of like your default alive, and you can get to default alive but have no safety cushion and you're still paranoid. But once you get to default alive and you have a safety cushion of, let's say, 6 months, right? You really can start focusing a lot more on like, how do I stay alive, but like, how do I grow, and how do I grow sustainably, and like, how do I hire the best people, and all these other things that are much more conducive to the long-term health of a company than like, what are the compromises I have to make today to not die?
When did you reach that moment? Like how long ago? When you shifted from survival to how do I grow?
I don't remember. I don't know. I think that was less important for me than the psychological side of understanding that it's cyclical, right? Like, I don't know how it was for you, but for me, if you like imagine a chart that goes like this, right? Like it was damn near like certain. The moment you felt things were going great, it would go terribly.
Oh, yes.
And the moment that things are going terribly, things would go great.
Yeah.
Like this was like a certainty. And once I'd ridden enough of these cycles, it stopped stressing me out. Because like I had a certainty. I knew that everything's wonderful now. It's going to go to shit. I know I know it's going to go to shit.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because I also know that it will get better after that, right? Like that, like just riding that wave enough times calmed the whole process down and like removed the stress. And maybe that was tied to the money. I don't know. But for me, psychologically, that was a much bigger thing than the financial side of it.
I agree. For me, it was such a cold shower, and it hit me so hard because I never, like before that, I've never had a business get to a stage where I would say, well, we're at this size, we're making a revenue, we're having employees. In my mind, my naive mind, I always thought that once you reach a point, it just becomes smooth sailing. And it hit me very hard when I realized that it doesn't matter that you can afford to pay someone this month, but something might happen tomorrow that will just ruin your entire week. And especially in an environment like Atlassian, where there's you're dependent on this platform, and there's new releases, there's new requirements, there's new competitors. This competitor did this, then it is.
So there's a whole platform risk side of thing there. But I actually learned this phrase a few months ago, which I really love. It's diseconomies of scale. right? Everybody knows economies of scale, right? You make a widget, it costs $1. You make 1 million widgets, it costs $0.01. You make more money, right? But there is also this concept of like, well, if you're going to make more widgets, now you need more people, right? More people means now you need HR, legal, etc., right? And those costs are new costs that you never had when you made a single widget.
Yeah.
And much in the same way that you have economic costs that increase, you have risks that on board too as you grow. So, for example, when it was like me and one person, I knew that person, we worked directly, everything's wonderful, right? I have had so many insane things happen to me running Atlas Authority, but this is the story I like to tell. We had a customer, one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. Everybody knows their name. They wanted somebody to work on site 40 hours a week in New York City. We didn't have anyone to do this, but we said, hey, we'll staff a new hire for this. Are you okay with that? They said, yes, but we want to be part of the interview process. We find somebody. We interview them. Get kind of a weird feeling, but they know their stuff. The customer interviews them. Gets a weird feeling, but again, they know their stuff. This guy goes through 5 rounds of interview, moves to New York City for the role, spends 2 weeks on site with the customer, and then proceeds to tell the customer, oh, I was just defrauding you guys during the interview. There was somebody coaching me on all the answers. I don't actually know any of this.
What? Wow.
And everybody was just like, what do you do, right? 5 rounds of interviews and like everybody greenlit it. The customer greenlit it. We greenlit it. Like burnt a relationship over this, right? Like the customer didn't want to work with us again after that.
I would feel that you would be able to tell though. What
Again,
did he do actually? Did he ever divulge what he done to fool all of you?
I don't know. He told the customer. The customer told me this.
Right.
And like, but again, it's like, what do you do, right? Like, obviously, you fire the guy, but then now you've lost this contract. Now you've lost this large customer, etc.
It's a big stain on you.
It's a huge stain, right? And the buying individual at that company is also very well known in the Atlassian ecosystem, right? So now it's like it'll spread. So anyways, thank God that person likes me and didn't make it a problem. I appreciate it. But for example, anyways, it could have been much worse, right? Yeah. So you get all of these kind of like new problems as you grow. And as you scale to a certain size, there is a guarantee that just mathematically certain failures will occur based on population sizes.
Yeah.
Right? Like none of us ever want to think that we're going to be running a company where harassment occurs. Well, you will. I guarantee you it'll happen once you reach a certain size because it's just a population average. You should work to prevent it. You should deal with it responsibly when it happens. But the idea that it will never happen is insane, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's on us to kind of try, like, I think these problems that we encounter as we grow our companies, it's our job as leaders to create systems and processes and cultures to build the guide rails to keep things from getting too far off track.
Yeah.
Right. And know that you will also fail. Like the guaranteed outcome is you will fail, but you still do the best you can.
Did you ever had anyone in your team that was let's say a culture misfit, a bit of toxicity kind and causing a more bad than good?
Not really. I think that generally I am not good at firing people quickly enough. That's my fault. But I don't think we've had people who weren't a fit, right? But we never had someone who was like actively causing problems for the whole team. We had people we should have let go. But I think one of the things that I've realized over my time kind of running the company, and something I'll kind of keep with me in the future as I start new companies, etc., will be that it doesn't make somebody a bad person for being a bad fit for your team.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Right?
Agreed.
Like it's not that they're dumb. It's not that they're lazy. It's not that they're a bad communicator or any of these things, right? Like I am a very, very polarizing individual. Many, many people do not like working with me and my style of work. And that's fine, right? Like I don't think that they should. But I think that there are enough workplaces working on enough problems in enough ways that we should all be able to find kind of the right one for us, right? Like I like a super direct style of communication, right? If like when I like at one point I sent out a survey, right? And like one of the most important questions on it was like, what is Boris doing wrong? Like name like 3 explicit things that he has to improve on, right? And actually every single one of my employees gave an identical response, which was wonderful because I was like, okay, cool. I can totally focus on these things. But for many people, when I provide direct feedback in that same way, like they can't take it. Right? And that's not to say that they're not a good person or they don't do good work or etc. But like, I just can't work with somebody like that effectively. Right? And so if, for example, I hired better managers to sit between me and them because I have found out I'm a bad manager, then maybe, there can be a translation layer or something. Maybe they should just work somewhere else, right? And that's not who I need for my team. I don't know. But ultimately, I think that you have to build the team to kind of meet the constraints of your current culture.
What makes you polarizing?
I think I'm very direct. I think that I can be arrogant. I tend to make a lot of assumptions, and I think they're usually right, but maybe that's the arrogance talking. But when I communicate with people and I have those assumptions in my head, right? Like I'm like, I'm making this assumption to like skip past all the BS basically. But they're like, you're skipping past all the BS. Like, how do you know that this is true? And, there's pros and cons to it. But I have found that, not everyone's going to love me. And when I was younger, I tried to change that. I was like, everyone has to love me. And now I'm like, it's okay. I just need enough people to love me that we can get the job done, right? And I don't need them to love me. I need them to effectively work with me. These aren't family members. These are not my best friends, right? At least in the Atlas Authority context, right? We're a 100% remote company. So this is not people I'm spending 8 hours a day with. We operated in a largely asynchronous manner. So most communication was Jira, Slack, GitHub, Confluence. So it was important enough to, like, it was hard enough to just get the job done that it wasn't like, I wasn't trying to get like the guys together. But I think that if I were to build another company, I would try and change that, right? I would actually aim to, like, when I look back at my time working at Atlassian, for example, I probably should have left earlier. I wasn't particularly happy working there, right? And I think it was a culture mismatch between us, and I was fairly immature in my behavior also at the time. But one of the reasons I stayed as long as I did was I just loved my team. And a lot of loving my team was not the, like we did great work together, right? It was the, like, we went out for drinks afterwards and we commiserated, right? And, we would go to shows together, or, we would do this or that. And there was a degree of friendship to it. And I think that if I'm going to be spending, 8+ hours a day of my time working on something, like, everyone's like, oh, you have to like care about the mission and all that. And like, I'm reading, Infinite Game right now, where like Simon Sinek talks about like just causes and all that. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. But like, also people need to untangle Ethernet cables, right? Like, and, if you're going to be untangling Ethernet cables and there's a lot of money to be made in it and a lot of work to be made in it, or like, you may not love your job, but I would at least like to enjoy my job more. And I think I can, now that I know how to build a company, I can try and design one where that's more the thing. And I feel like if I were to create another company, a key focus for me would be like not just creating a company to solve a problem for customers, but it would be to create a company, to create a workplace, to create a playpen for myself almost, right? Like I almost want to create my own kindergarten, right? Like where like I can go and play and have fun. And yes, we solve problems for customers, right? And like that will be a thing. And like, yes, we make money. But I think at this point in my life, I would really love if I could achieve that.
Yeah, that was what Jigsaw was for Nikki and I, because we always started the company because of, we wanted a playpen, a playground for ourselves. And it was a really good feeling to be able to, have the financial backing to do that and be able to grow a team exactly the way we were interested in, with the same culture and so on. So yeah, and especially now that you have the, in a sense, financial backing, you can do that. You can, without thinking very hard. Yeah, of course, you have to sustain whatever you do, but in the early days, you don't have to think way too hard around what sacrifices do I need to make in order to generate revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I actually am still being very, very conservative financially.
I mean, you look at every can on what cost.
But no, I mean in the sense of like, look, I sold my company to Modus Create, great bunch of people, really love them. But in my spare time, like I'm still a founder, right? And like, I still want to make things, right? Like there is a thing in me that's like, if you go back to when I was in elementary school or middle school, like my favorite classes were like wood shop, metal shop, ceramics. Like I like making stuff. Like it's something that's core to me. I think that in general, Modus has been a good partner to work with. Like I would even go so far as to say, like during the sale process, I did a bad job of hiring legal and financial representation on my side. And their lawyers were pointing out my lawyer's mistakes to me so that I could better negotiate against them. Like, they've been very kind and nice people to work with. And I think I've heard enough horror stories in our ecosystem from enough people about enough acquisitions where it is very clear that I made a pretty good choice with who to partner. I had a very clear set of guidelines of what I wanted when I sold the company. And I did not take the highest offer, for example. I had a higher offer for like how much somebody wanted to pay. But I was like, what is going to be a win-win-win all around, right? I needed to be a win for the buyer, which it almost always is. I needed to be a win for the customers, and I needed to be a win for the employees and for me, right? So obviously buyer got it, great, good for them. Customers so far are spending significantly more money with us since the acquisition, which I think is a pretty good signal about the value that they see that they're getting. And I think there hasn't really been any logo churn either. So that means that like it's not like we're like upselling to this group and ignoring this group, right? For employees, immediately after acquisition, benefits improved. Like we had decent benefits at Atlas Authority, but here they improved. And since then, at least 2 people I know have gotten meaningful promotions. And I think others are on track. And I think most people have gotten at least a significant pay increase, right? And then obviously I got cashed out on my equity, right? Yeah. So I thought that was a way to kind of be, as ethical as I could about the whole thing of protecting everyone involved. And picking someone who would ultimately have a good workplace for everyone involved, and even for me, right? Because like I'm still working there. I think it was a right bet, if nothing else, just in terms of like mental health and and just ability to like deal with the acquirer on a daily basis.
Yeah, but what made you decide to sell? What was the catalyst for that? Because before that, I have another question around one. I just wanted to clarify something. You mentioned earlier that you started building up the marketplace, the apps business as well. Was your vision to eventually get that to become the primary business focus?
No, the original thought was to smooth out cash flows, right? Again, it was this concept of like, how do we make sure that there is no such thing as a bad month?
Yeah.
Right? Like you can have great months and you can have okay months, but you should never have a bad month, right? And you can do that through diversification of revenue streams. And that was the original thought, and that was the thought all the way through. Now, I think where you were going with this kind of a minute ago was like, why did I sell the company, right? Which actually fits into all of this.
Yeah.
I was, let's say, frustrated with the various platform issues around Atlassian. And I think realistically, the answer is I let it get to me. Like it was probably a suboptimal decision to sell, or at least to sell how I did. When I talk to founders now about selling their companies, I typically give the advice of go see a therapist and talk through why you want to sell the company and how is that going to impact all of the non-financial things in your life. For example, how much of your identity, like how much do you see yourself as a reflection of your role as a founder and CEO, right? How much do you value the unending fire hose of BS that the company sends at you? Because it is weird when that stops, right? How much, or I'll give you one that I found out about myself. Do you know if you like income more than wealth?
Right, I know what you mean.
I thought I wanted a large pile of money. I found out that was wrong. I actually prefer income more, right? So for me, I would say, like, honestly, I quote unquote regret selling. Like in hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. Or actually, that's not quite true. In hindsight, I would have sold the services and licensing business and focused on products, right? It's fine. Hindsight's 2020, can't undo it. Again, like Modus have been a good home for me, no problem. Now, yeah, I guess, I'm not quite sure what that means in the future. I don't know what that means for future companies I build, etc. But I do think that, the existence of the product portion of the company has definitely garnered my interest over time and feels more aligned with kind of what I will be doing in the future.
Okay. So you want to get into product?
Well, just in general, I think, like, for example, my dad told me at one point, he's like, so you've run this playbook in the Atlassian ecosystem. Why don't you just go run it in one of the other ecosystems, right? Like there's plenty of other ecosystems. Like go build a Salesforce partner, do services, do licensing.
Yeah,
that's
apps, a very reasonable path.
Yeah. And I was like, but Dad, like I did it in the Atlassian ecosystem because I was differentiated individually, right? Like the whole brand was basically tied to me, right? It was like Boris knows this stuff really, really well. Everybody in the ecosystem knows Boris. That makes sense, right? Like I was like a micro influencer or something. If I try and go do that in the Salesforce ecosystem, nobody knows me.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about me. Like, there is no differentiation. Like, I have no chance. So I don't think I'm going to do that. I do think it's possible that I will do another, like, do some kind of services and then pivot into a product play in the future, just because I think that services are just an amazing way of doing product discovery and finding out, like, what are your customers' actual pain points. But longer term, I do think that I just like more consistent revenue. And I don't emotionally want to deal with the volatility of enterprise sales for services and licenses, which is like, you have 1 month. I mean, I can tell at Atlas Authority, we had, I think, 20% of annual revenue come in every February.
Oh, wow.
Right? Which is like, that's wonderful, but it's also terrifying the rest of the year, right? Like, when you're like,
and the expectation, I suppose, because you're like, is everyone going to pay in time and in February, or we're getting 20%?
Yeah.
Of 20% of the 20%.
Yeah. And so there was, it was just a lot of, there's a lot of, like, business will always be stressful, and there will always be challenges, etc. But I found that basically there are challenges that we are better at dealing with and challenges that we're worse at dealing with individually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and if you are at a point where you can staff the right person to the right stress point where it's not a problem for them, then, like, that's amazing, right? But for my personal operational style, etc., I think that consistent revenue from subscription software is probably where I will play for the foreseeable future.
Okay. You said something interesting, and I want to dig into that. You said that you realized that you're a revenue kind of person, not a wealth kind of person. Why is that?
Well, because I was working on this marketplace idea, and I was like, okay, I can fund it out of pocket, but it'll be pretty expensive, and it's a pretty big bet. I did some math, and I was like, okay, let's realistically say, second time founder is much more likely to succeed, complex problem, this and that. I was like, okay, there's like 2% chance of success. Like, it's pretty good on a founder, on a business. Like, most businesses fail, so like 2% is like really nice. And I was like, okay, I don't want to risk this percentage of my net worth on a 2%, likelihood of return. Like, I have conviction, but I don't have that much conviction, I guess. And so then I went out and I had to, like, do the dance of begging for money. And I was like, oh, God, I hate this. And I feel like if I had that revenue, I could just say, like, oh, I can fund experiments out of the revenue. And I can when Atlas Authority existed, I had a pretty hard policy, which is like, any experiment under 10K is approved.
Oh, wow.
Like, it doesn't matter, right? Like there's pretty much nothing that you do under 10K that's a bad bet, at least at the scale that we were operating.
Yeah.
Right. Like, with our revenues and our profit margins, et cetera, I was comfortable basically being like, all you need is like shoot me a quick email telling me what you want to do and I'll approve it. Like, I need to be informed more so than approve it. Right. Like, it's like, let me know and I won't veto it is more the approach that I took. Right. Because like 10K, it's really, really hard to move the needle significantly at the scale that we were at without spending 10K. And it's also really, really hard to ask people to do things with like micro budgets where it just slows everything down, right? So it's like, I want to fund experimentation. I want to work with people that want to run experiments. And I want to have outsized payoffs. And I can even, like I mentioned earlier, for example, that we acquired most of our apps, right?
Yeah.
So I think we did something like 6 or 7 or maybe 8 acquisitions. And of those, 2 have driven all the returns, right? So it's like 1 out of 3 chance, right?
Were these all part of your ethos of invest 10K, or did you pay more than that?
We paid significantly more,
right?
But the point was that like we understood that. Okay, let me put it to you this way: one app that succeeds makes more money in 1 month than we've paid for all the apps combined.
Yeah.
Right. So like, the math for success is very, I wouldn't say power law distributed. That is a thing, but like, I don't think we're quite there, but it is not evenly distributed. And I think, there's this common thing that people will sometimes say is that like, oh, this and this person failed up. Right. And I'm like, I think I'm kind of that, because like I fail at so much stuff, but because I try so much stuff, invariably something hits. And when it hits big. Right. And if you look at it like a casino, right, you're just betting with time, right? And money is just a shortcut for time, generally, right? Like when I give somebody 10K to do an experiment, usually it's not like, oh, give 10K to Google and let's run 10K of ads. I mean, I'm sure we tried that, but like that's typically not what I'm talking about. Typically, I'm saying like, hey, here's 10K, buy the tools that will empower you to do 10K worth of work that you otherwise would have spent 3 months on, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think of it that way, like our lives, like we have a finite amount of time in our lives, and I'm like, okay, like I'm gonna have some kind of risk reward balance that fits me, and I'm gonna hedge bets enough, right? And there will be enough kind of returns, and they happen in weird ways. Like we had one app which was doing the majority of our revenue, like the drastic majority, and now it's in second place. One of our other apps was free. We eventually released a paid version of it, and that app like skyrocketed past the original. It's like you never know this stuff, right? Like,
yeah, I mean that's the very common strategy. We kind of stayed away from that at Jigsaw in the early days, but it does seem like it's a really good strategy to get something out there and known. Having a free version of that and offering it.
I mean, hey, if you want to talk about strategy, weird stuff, literally the second app we ever made, I think before we ever had a single services customer. So this is before I left Uber, was iframes for Confluence. So you go into Confluence, you insert the macro, you put a URL in, we iframe it. Not that complicated.
Yeah.
Okay? Makes quite a lot of money. You would be amazed at how much money this makes, right? And for years I was joking. I'm like, ha ha ha, I'm the idiot iframe guy that prints money, right? But I didn't have the foresight to brand the damn iframes, because now you have Figma for Confluence, you have Miro for Confluence, you have HubSpot for Confluence, you have all these freaking iframes, and they're making amazing amounts of money by just delivering the same damn app over and over and over again with different branding, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, I was this close, but I didn't quite see my own strategy through far enough. But that's the beauty of it, right? Like you learn distribution, you learn branding, you learn marketing, you learn kind of how customers look to solve their problems, and you get better at all of it.
Speaking of branding and marketing, let's talk about your personal brand in the Atlassian ecosystem.
Spicy.
So you've always been quite straightforward in your engagement in the community, and with Atlassian, with other vendors on Slacks and so on, you kind of
talk too much.
Yeah, no, you speak your mind.
Sure, yeah.
Right. How did you get to be a, I don't know what you call yourself, a micro influencer or an influencer in the Atlassian ecosystem?
Well,
was that something forceful? Was it premeditated, or was it just organic?
No, I think in general, everyone has strengths and weaknesses, right? And like, for example, I said earlier, like I have ADD. Great. So, when I looked at like my ADD, for example, there's like, oh, you can't focus, or like, oh, it doesn't do this, or like, you don't do that, or, whatever. But if you look at it, like those same traits viewed from a different perspective are strengths, and you can utilize them, and they can be superpowers or whatever you want to call them. Right. And I think that my outspokenness, I don't know if that'd be the right word, the way I communicated within Atlassian even, right? Because I was the same when I was an employee, came largely from immaturity, right? It wasn't a premeditated thing. It wasn't that I'm some genius or this or that. I was just immature and arrogant and, too full of myself. And I have for years, and I continue to try and do less of that. Now, while it was immature behavior, it is immature behavior still. When I do it, it is typically well-intentioned. Mm-hmm. Like, even if I get into an argument with you, it's not because I'm like, oh, I want to prove you're wrong. It's because I truly believe that the thing you're advocating for will cause harm to either myself or you even, or to our customers or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think most people, when they see what I say, see that sincerity. And so even when I'm not, let's say, on my best behavior, it in a way builds trust with people. Like, okay, for example, I had somebody in the Atlassian ecosystem message me yesterday, and they wrote, hey, I'm considering having Modus do some development work for us for one of our apps. I know you work for them. I also trust you to tell me the truth about them. Should I work with you or not, and why? And I did tell them the truth, right? And they knew that, like, if I said something, I honestly believe it, right?
Yeah.
And, when I was selling to customers, for example, I was also, like, I'm not a classically trained salesperson, right? The way that I did sales was I'd go to a customer, I'd say, look, here's what we do. Here's how much we're going to charge you for it. Here's how much we're going to make, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, here's all my cards on the table. I'm like, every other competitor is going to sell you some kind of BS, but you know exactly what I'm doing and why here. And that's why you should work with me. And that worked with a certain subset of customers, right? Like, that was my way of doing sales. And much in the same way, just being honest and transparent with, Atlassian and with other ecosystem partners, et cetera, has been an effective communication strategy. It also has its problems, right? There are a lot of people who don't like me. That's fine. I apologize to them for any harm I've caused. And I continue to work to actually be better, right? Like, there's currently a conversation going on in the Atlassian community about something where I wrote a really long and upset post yesterday, and then I changed it into like one question instead. Right? Of like I try and catch myself. I try and improve. I'm not perfect. I hope to get better. And I appreciate people's patience and forgiveness.
Well, I think, one, you're really and deeply self-analyzing of what your identity is. You're completely okay with who you are, which everyone should be at the end of the day. But it does seem like you are fully aware of where you sit in the ecosystem, in the community, and you're embracing that as is, which, again, I think it's a good thing. You felt comfortable I suppose, in being who you are, Boris from Atlas Authority and sharing this, helping people here with your advice and in the community, knocking at Atlassian's door with this topic and that topic and so on. I suppose you're doing all of this, you don't feel extremely uncomfortable, or do you?
No, but I think for me, it's like I said, it's a certain degree of arrogance on my side where like I'm confident that my way is the best way, even though there's no evidence to really support that.
But do you feel that ever impacted or hurt your business?
Absolutely.
Did it?
Absolutely. Regularly. To this day, it still hurts it. They're like, I'm constrained on what I can say.
Okay.
But yeah, it has meaningfully harmed the business, like in a significant way. Like,
as in you being very outspoken and strong with Atlassian.
Yes. It has impacted me. It has impacted the company. I think that it will continue to impact me as long as I'm in the Atlassian ecosystem. I think that part of why I initially sold the company was my plan was to get out of the ecosystem, to get away from that reputation to a degree and to try and reset, right? And build kind of a new reputation elsewhere. But, the internet is eternal. So, yeah. And in my case, it goes even further, right? Because if somebody works at Atlassian, they can just go into internal systems and see the blog posts that I wrote when I was 22, 23 or something, right? And yeah, it's definitely been an issue. I guess I'm lucky in that, I can be successful in spite of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm lucky that it also hasn't been that bad, right? Like it could have been worse, right? Like there's the problem with platform risk is, right? Like they can just turn you off, for example.
Yeah.
Like didn't happen yet. But like, that's a risk, right? You see it. Like, there's a thread on Hacker News like once a month of like, Stripe killed my business, or like Apple killed my business, or Google shut down my app, or like whatever, right? Like that is platform risk by definition. And people get hit by it. Like could be malice. It could be automated systems. It could be a disgruntled employee, right? Like there was literally a thing last week. Some Vercel employee used his access to like threaten a Vercel customer over a trademark dispute. And I think Vercel ultimately fired the employee, but like the platform, like that's a hosting platform risk, right?
Yeah.
Like there's always this kind of stuff.
But I think so far, at least Atlassian has been better with it versus, because if you look at YouTube, at that, they're very authoritative when it comes. And I suppose they have to, because there's a lot higher stakes than Atlassian as in a sense as well. But I feel that Atlassian's been quite good so far with not pushing this to a state where people get disconnected with no motive or with very little motive, in a sense.
I think only time will tell. Specifically to YouTube, there's a book called Like, Comment, Subscribe, which is like the unofficial history of YouTube kind of thing. I forget the author, but easy to find. And I highly recommend it to anybody that's building any kind of company with platform risk, because like as I read the book, I was like, oh, this is exactly like the Atlassian ecosystem. Like it is the same exact stuff. Like the same problems of communication between platform and people on it, the same types of like market shifts, risks, like the parallels are crazy actually. So if anyone's building on a platform, like definitely go read that book. I think in general, what I would say is that Atlassian, again, like I've been in this ecosystem 12 years or something now. My gut feel is that over the last 2 years, they have turned a corner and are doing better and better regularly. I know many other people don't share that perspective. That's fine. But my gut feel is that things are trending better right now, which I'm grateful for. And it makes my business easier. It makes my mental health better. It makes them easier to cooperate with and work with. And so, I hope that continues. But just like my business was cyclical, I know Atlassian is also cyclical, right? There will be periods of improvement. There will be periods of things getting harder. And that's fine. Like, it's just kind of maybe I'm maturing where I'm just like getting used to that and understanding that these are like the natural ebbs and flows of life. But I'm fine in this ecosystem for now. And while I think that there are challenges here, and I do, again, like I built my company in a way to hedge risk.
Yeah.
In conversations with other marketplace vendors, let's say even actually just this week, one of the main conversations was, how are you hedging risk? What other marketplaces are you building on? Probably the number one topic of conversation, right? Maybe Atlassian cares, maybe they don't care. I don't know, right? But this is kind of like the ebb and flow of the whole thing, right? Like vendor's going to vendor, platform will platform. The chips will fall where they fall, right? Like,
yeah. Well, honestly, I feel that we can sit here for another 2 hours and talk about all of this stuff and dig deeper.
I have a lot of faults, and one of them is that I can talk forever.
Yeah, me too. I find myself, because when there's two people that can talk quite a lot, I find myself like having to, okay, let me just like give you the space to express yourself. I do close with 3 questions. If you've seen the show, you probably know what those are. First one is, what's a quote that you live by?
I have a terrible memory, so I don't actually know quotes.
Okay.
I guess I can give a piece of advice, which is don't die and let compounding. Basically, my thing now is just like compounding is the work horse of life. Like, whether it's in networking, whether it's in helping people, whether it's in money, like, just focus on compounding. Like, and you have to, like, people don't understand compounding, like, inherently, right? Like, if I tell you there's a billion of something, like, nobody really understands what a billion is. Like, it's a bullshit number, right? Like, you can understand like 20, you can understand like 100, even like 1,000 is kind of weird. Like, what does 1,000 pairs of shoes look like? I don't know. Like, I'm sure there's some sneakerhead who's like, I know exactly what that looks like. But compounding is even harder to understand because it's not an amount, it's a rate of change.
Yeah.
And until you get a really visceral feel for compounding, you don't start like using it as a way of thinking. And so I guess my advice would be like, figure out how to feel compounding. Because once you feel it, it becomes this like weird thing of like, you start looking at everything through like, how do I compound this?
I do feel that that's a very strong quotable statement or instruction, which is don't die, continue compounding, or don't die and compound. Right? Like, that's a really good one. A book that changed or impact your life?
Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. It is a masterpiece of a book. It is massive. It is an absolute slog to get through. There are hard parts, right? But like, it is an amazing, amazing, amazing book. And I think that it has enough characters that everyone should kind of see themselves reflected in it in some way.
Is it for you one of those books that you read multiple times?
I will read it multiple times, but it is so long that I think last time I read it, it took me more than a month.
Okay.
And the last time I read it, I think was 2 years ago. So I think that I will probably read, like I'll definitely read it again, but it will probably be in another couple of years. I currently have a backlog of, I think, 200 books to read. And I tend to do about 50 books a year, or like between 30 and 50 books a year. Yeah, we'll see. You know, yeah.
Yeah, it is a good book. Last question before we end, and give you your gift as a guest. Good habit that you advocate for.
I guess this ties back to the compounding thing, but it's just like move the ball forward every day. Like if you get up and you can't do sales today, do some marketing. If you can't do marketing today, do some finance stuff.
Right.
Like
so do something.
Just it doesn't matter what you do. Like obviously it matters what you do, right? But like if you're just sick as a dog, right? Read a business book, right? Or listen to a business book. Like find a way to move that ball forward, because that is what feeds into the compounding.
You know what this is. So you are guest number 16th. I can't believe I had 16 guests since July, and you're getting your own little coin.
This is a challenge coin. Do you know how these are used in the military? Well, U.S. military?
No.
So in the U.S. military, they'll give out, oh, this is hard to get out. Yeah.
It should be that hard.
My nails are cut.
Let me try.
Anyway, so in the U.S. military, you get a coin like this when you serve in a unit, and then you're supposed to carry it with you at all times. And then when you show up at like a bar or something, somebody can pull one of the coins out, and then everybody has to pull the coin out. Right. And whoever doesn't have it has to pay for all the booze.
Right. That's actually a good idea. Yeah. So
if I find another Misfit founder out there, be ready, because you're paying.
Yeah, have it in your pocket. Nikki was saying there it would have been better to have pouches, right? So you can carry it with you. But I feel that this is good as well, because you can just put it on your shelf.
Yeah, definitely.
There you go.
I like it. Thank you very much.
And I'll also send you an email with there's a guest code where you'll get a few more benefits that I'm not going to talk about just now. So
I'll post it on Twitter.
Yeah, you're part of the club now, the Misfit Founders Club. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for the amazing stories. Again, we're ending this conversation what it feels like earlier than needed in a sense. I feel that we can do more, but I think that it's not the last I hear of you, and looking forward to have you back with your whatever's
next. Yeah,
whatever's next, whatever your next mission is.
Yeah, you know, the nice thing is, you know, you just keep getting up and get up to like the at bat, right? I don't like baseball actually, but I think it's like it doesn't make sense to me as a sport, but I do love it as a business idea of like you just get up there and you swing and you miss most of the time, and like that just is what it is.
Eventually you hit.
Eventually you hit it, right?
Like, eventually you might hit a home run.
Exactly, exactly. And it's like I don't like the sport, but it's an amazing business metaphor.
Yes, 100%. Well, thank you so much.